From the right, I'm Matt Lewis.
From the left, I'm Bill Scher.
And you're watching
The Week in Blog.
This week, we talk about Sue Loudon and bartering for chickens in Nevada. We talk about a fight on the right between what I would call academic, intellectual, conservative writers, and on the other side, bloggers and radio talk show hosts. But first, Bill, the big news this week, at least on the political front, has been about Florida Governor Charlie Crist. Will he stay or will he go? What say you, Bill Scher?
Well, I think everyone in the political world and the pundit world is presuming at this point that Crist will leave the Republican Party and run for Senate as an independent. In the liberal blogosphere, there's been varying commentary about what that move means. You had Jonathan Zasloff at the reality-based community, SameFacts.com, talking about if Crist actually won as an independent, who would he caucus with? And this is going to be a question that I'm sure Crist is going to have to answer, presuming he makes this move. Because Lieberman and Sanders are independent senators, but they caucus with Democrats. They vote for Harry Reid for majority leader. So in many ways, they're de facto Democrats. What would Crist do? Zasloff says Lieberman was an incumbent senator, and Crist, of course, is not, but I don't see that as particularly relevant here. Crist was recruited by national Republicans. He saved John McCain's presidential campaign in the Florida primary and was rewarded this week by attacks from the Arizona senator. All of his supposed friends went south on him as soon as it got tough. They didn't even bother with neutrality. Once Crist takes the knife out of his back, he might consider whom he would be able to trust in the Senate if he gets there. And over at 538, Nate Silver, dissecting some polling data and using his quote-unquote intuition, predicts that Rubio is going to have a hard 36% floor for a vote, consolidate a conservative base, which is saying doesn't necessarily mean that he would win or lose, just saying that either Crist or the Democrat Kendrick Meek, who's not even getting much attention right now, they're going to have to find a way to break 36.
Yeah.
And Silver wasn't putting great odds on that, but still making the point that it's the only chance Crist has at all of winning, because there's no way he's getting out of the Republican primary. And this just leads to the question, that combination of partisan Democrats and independents of all stripes, which way will they break in a three-way race? And that's extremely hard to get your arms around. But then you have the Marco Rubio story at the same time, and Jonathan Singer and Matt D.D. pointed this out. He's now probably under federal investigation from the IRS about his use of credit card, party credit cards. And he said, anyone thinks this election is in the bag for Rubio is off their rocker, because you know that's going to play out. So that's the range of liberal blogosphere analysis of this. What's going on the conservative side?
Well, your first couple points you made actually are being echoed by conservative bloggers, or at least being addressed. So you started off talking about who would he caucus with. Jim Antle over at the American Spectator looked at Chris Cillizza's piece on this and says, when Lieberman went the independent route, he had Michael Bloomberg's proven campaign team right next door. He had his own national fundraising base with Jewish donors and people who had been attracted to his forays into national politics. Lieberman also saw the primary through, only lost it narrowly, and had the tacit support of a Republican administration and no serious Republican opponent. That meant Lieberman could win an overwhelming majority of Republicans, a respectable majority of independents, and still hang on to a third of Democrats. None of these situations will obtain for Charlie Crist. And it's a good point. Philip Klein, also at The Spectator, echoed your point that, or echoed one of the progressive bloggers' points, saying, yes, it's true that Crist's independent run would encounter obstacles, but it's at least plausible that he can win, whereas if he stays in the Republican primary or drops out of the race altogether, he's virtually assured to be out of office in January. I think where we have a little disagreement between conservative bloggers and liberal bloggers is over this whole question of whether or not the recent scandal, will hurt him. On one hand, you have Eric Erickson.
Alleged scandal, Matt Lewis.
Alleged scandal.
It's only an investigation. No indictments.
It is a scandal, but it's an alleged crime, malfeasance, whatever. It is a bona fide scandal, but the malfeasance, misfeasance, whatever feasance, that's alleged. But so Eric Erickson actually argues that the investigation has more to do with Charlie Crist than Marco Rubio. The point there being that Crist, the allegations made about former RNC chairman Greer, he was Charlie Crist's right-hand man, or at least a Crist ally, not a Rubio ally. Eric Erickson thinks the probe is more damaging to Charlie Crist than the Rubio. He had a title of a post called "Charlie Crist GOP comes under federal investigation, Rubio affected." But there's not unanimous agreement on this. Ed Morrissey over at Hot Air writes, Rubio has the most to lose since he's the front runner in the race. He's the only one candidate whose name has been attached to the scandal, and I think that's a good point. NRO's Jim Garrity says he's basically betting his political future on the idea he can win enough votes. This is back to Crist, can he win or not, among apolitical types who aren't paying attention to overcome the votes from the political types who are. So, in any event, I think what we have here are conservatives agreeing that Crist can only win if he becomes an independent, but will the scandal stick? Disagreement as to whether or not they'll stick to Rubio at this point.
I mean, so it would just seem as if, I don't think we know how this investigation turns out, but is there a certain, corner of the conservative blogger stomach that's sort of, I hope this comes out okay. I hate to see we put all our chips in the Rubio basket. Hope it's going to be all right.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of, I think this is the kind of thing. And part of the other issue is that Charlie Crist has been pushing this idea, this credit card idea that Rubio, in some way, put personal items on his RNC credit card or his Florida Republican Party credit card. I think he has admitted that he's done it, but that he reimbursed the party. So he might have gotten a haircut, didn't have his credit card, paid for it with the Florida Republican Party card, and then reimbursed them.
I mean, that's very much the way that the so-called House Bank scandal went down. It was at 91, I believe, where there were all these headlines about how Congress was, robbing taxpayers blind with these ridiculous House Bank. They could run up all these bills and not pay them, but in effect, it's the exact same thing. They would reimburse, and it really wasn't that big of a deal. But having to give that explanation was not terribly politically helpful. Yeah,
it's the kind of thing where once you're explaining, you're losing.
Right.
And so the question is, does this stick or does it not stick? At this point, I think conservatives are clearly sold on Marco Rubio for a variety of reasons. So there's no going back at this point. Now, some people have speculated maybe Charlie Crist should now stay in the Republican Party in case the bottom falls out for Rubio.
But he's got to decide by the 30th, right?
I think so. I mean, it's definitely imminent. There is a quickly approaching deadline whereby he would have to decide if he stays or if he goes. Let me also make a point that not a lot of people have made, I don't think, so far, but I'm starting to think that these endorsements are not helping Rubio. I think they were, but now...
He just got Dick Cheney
He
this
got
week,
Dick
right?
Cheney, who also endorsed K. Billy Hutchison, who also endorsed Trey Grayson in Kentucky. Clearly, he's an establishment candidate. I mean, I think part of the attraction to Rubio has always been that he was young and anti-establishment outsider. And at what point does he become sort of the Republican insider establishment candidate? I mean, if he's getting endorsed... Look, and I tweeted about this today, Bill. I kind of view my politicians the way that a lot of kids view their underground garage bands. It's like... I like them until they become famous and sell out,
right.
And
right.
I'm always afraid they're going to be co-opted by the man, or whatever. So I kind of liked it better before Romney and Cheney started endorsing Rubio. And here's the other thing about it: they've had very harsh words for Charlie Crist. Dick Cheney really went after Crist in his endorsement. Isn't there a sense that might push Crist out the door? I mean, look, I think he was already going to become an independent anyway. I don't mean to sound naive. But I think it might be better if Cheney'd endorsed Crist. keep him in the Republican Party where Rubio will beat him. Keep Rubio as the outsider running against the establishment of the Republican Party. And why do we want to throw stones at Crist right now? He hasn't left yet. But I almost feel like, look, I think he was going to leave anyway, but if he wasn't, he has to now, doesn't he? I mean, I don't know. It just struck me as kind of weird.
It is in that respect, but I also think that any outsider candidate eventually has to make a pivot towards being seriously viable. And not just, I mean, this is where, politics is different than indie rock. Indie rock band can thrive on a niche fan base, and a politician at the end of the day has got to get 50% plus. Though granted, in a three-way race, maybe he's 37. But
yeah, no, that's a good point. And it is funny. I think that
everyone
this
thought
is the
that
whole
Howard
McCain
Dean made a big
phenomenon.
mistake getting Al Gore's endorsement
Yeah.
a month before Iowa, but it's not that the endorsement was the problem. It's that once the endorsement happened, the target was on his back, and it's up to the front runner to navigate that new chapter of his or her candidacy. But you're always, if any outsider candidacy that does well is going to hit that point, then it's a question of how do you manage the transition.
I thought you were about keeping it real, man. I thought this was all about. This used to be about the music.
No, I'm about winning.
Oh, so I see how it is. Okay.
What other unrelated, but on the Chris Rubio race on the liberal side?
Yeah.
Blue Texan at Fire Dog Lake pointed out the difference in the Washington pundit reaction to Crist being effectively chased out of the Republican Party versus when Joe Lieberman was chased out of the Democratic Party. When Joe Lieberman was chased out by Ned Lamont, Blue Texan reminded, Cokie Roberts on ABC asserted it would be, quote, a disaster for the Democratic Party. It would lead to chaos if Ned Lamont won. They're pushing the party to the left and saying the message of the center is the only smart thing to do is to play to your base. Now, Lieberman was pushed out. But it certainly was not Armageddon for the Democratic Party. They managed to do okay for themselves in both 06 and 08. But that whole line of argument doesn't seem to be coming out of the pundits right now. Blue Texan quotes, this is from, where's this source? Excuse me. From The Atlantic. De facto GOP White House favorite Mitt Romney endorsed Rubio yesterday. And as Josh Green noted, Romney got beat up over this. It's easy to endorse Rubio now that he leads the Senate primary against Crist. What about Rubio was a mere conservative upstart when his biggest backers were the influential blogger Eric Erickson and the Free Enterprise DC interest group, the Club for Growth? This morning, their big-time Republican hopped on the Rubio train, Eric Cantor. So the pundits are giving flack to, as you were saying, giving flack to the establishment Republicans, not giving flack to Rubio for pulling the party rightward.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. I think that part of it is that Rubio is a much more attractive candidate than Ned Lamont. And I think some of it is that that if you look at the differences as Jim Antle discussed about the differences between Lieberman, I think Lieberman was much better equipped to run and win as an independent than Crist is. So that might be to account for some of it. And look, some of it might be a double standard. I don't know. But for what, and some of it too, I think has to do with narratives. Like, a year ago, Republicans could do nothing right, and liberals would have these internecine squabbles, and they would never get discussed. But if a Republican, had a crossword with another Republican, there'd be a whole bunch of stories about how the Republican Party was falling apart, and there's fragging going on, and I think that the narrative has started to shift. People think it's going to be a Republican year. So for whatever reason, I think there's less hand-wringing at this point about is Republican Party a big tent enough? God knows how many stories we endured about that last year. But that's my take. Anyway, what do you think? I mean, do you think it's a double standard?
I do think it's a double standard. I think there's something in, and this is, I think, part of the liberal blogger narrative from the beginning. There's something in the Washington punditocracy water. I think a lot of these folks, have some, liberal leanings.
Yeah.
And they react to that by this complete overcompensation, where they always self-flagellate anything that's proudly liberal as being woefully out of step with the nation, and anything that is rock-ribbed conservative is emanating from the American heartland, and woe was you for disrespecting that. And I think politics is much more complicated than that.
Another point, Bill, is that although Charlie Crist was very popular at one point, he's in Florida, but Joe Lieberman was in Washington D.C. He was a U.S. Senator for many years. He would go on.
He was chummier with that crowd.
Exactly. So I think that that might have something to do with it as well.
I completely agree with that.
That whole inside the Beltway cocktail party mentality. I bet you Lieberman was hanging out with David Frum at some of those cocktail parties.
I would not be surprised. The other big Senate story this week is in Nevada.
Yes.
Where one of the leading GOP nominees, the GOP primary to choose who would challenge Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, has not happened yet. One of the leading candidate, Sue Loudon, made this very odd argument against health care reform, where she insisted that we should be basing our health care system on barter, telling a local news program, quote, "I'm telling you that this works. Before we all started having health care in the olden days, our grandparents would bring a chicken to the doctor." Now, what's interesting about this is that it's not a stray comment. It's one thing to sort of shrug it off as a little stream of consciousness thought, not the basis of one's policy. But this actually happened a week ago, where she made that sort of comment, and there was some blogger reaction to it, chuckling at it. But also, I think both Atrios and Talking Points Memo had said, she probably means bargain and not barter. So let's not dump on her too much. But then she, doubled down and expounded on the point this week. So Josh Marshall, Talking Points Memo, said, a couple weeks ago, I mocked her with the headline, "I bid 3 chickens for that MRI," unquote, but I sort of figured she'd rethink that plan after her advisors sat her down for a moment and explained the concept of a cash economy. Or maybe she just found out what barter meant, but it turns out she was serious. Not just serious, she was actually thinking about payments and chickens, too. And so this has prompted all sorts of snark in the liberal blogosphere. Over at TAP, the American Prospect blog, Paul Waldman, "How many chickens is my copay?" Atrios on Twitter said, "Crap, my doctor's a vegan." So I guess the question I have, as far as how the conservatives are reacting for this, is are they rallying to her defense? I know her team is you sent it a whole memo to the press talking about how this is not an unusual idea, but it is a primary situation, so bloggers could be saying, "Okay, this woman is damaged goods. Let's go with the other guy who's not going to say crazy stuff like we should be paying doctors with chickens."
Yeah, well, first of all, conservatives are not spending a lot of time focusing on this race. And I think part of it is that, there's so many of these races, and we almost all conservative writers and bloggers know people on both sides. And this is also true in the case of Carly Fiorina, that race for California Senate, where we're just kind of inundated with stuff, and a lot of times they try to push things that aren't even really news, and so there hasn't been a lot. Again, I mean, there are 2 front-runner. Well, Sue Loudon is the front-runner for this race. She's the chicken lady. A guy named Danny Tarkanian is, a distant second from her at this point. He was a UNLV basketball star. His dad was a legendary coach of UNLV. Loudon has a lot more experience. I think she beat a Senate majority leader in the Nevada State Senate. She was a TV personality, sort of like back in the days when Ron Burgundy days, right? She was like, she was like an evening TV host when everybody watched, the 5 o'clock news or the 6 o'clock news or whatever in their local market. And so she also, I think, was Miss New Jersey at one point before she moved to Nevada. Tarkanian's run for things before, has never won, but he's definitely been involved in politics. There's other people in the race too, but Loudon and Tarkanian are the two most prominent. Conservatives have generally not written much about this race. I think there's just a feeling that let them fight it out, and then whoever wins, then they'll jump on the bandwagon and try to beat.
There's been a sense
Harry
for a
Reid.
while that Reid was practically dead man walking. That he's been down, by just 20 points in polls. But isn't this perhaps causing some concern on the right, saying maybe Reid might be having a tough time in Nevada, but if this is the quality of his opposition, maybe we need to try to draft someone else into this thing because this is not going so well.
It's basically too late for anybody else to get in the race. There's no reason to believe that Tarkanian is any better than Loudon. I think that the truth is that both Republican frontrunners are going to have a learning curve and a money curve. They're both beating Harry Reid in the polls consistently, but Harry Reid is a fighter. I have no doubt that the Harry Reid machine is pushing this narrative, and Harry Reid's tough. He seems like a little, spindly little wimp, but the guy was a boxer. He was, taking on mobsters and whatnot in Vegas. He's a tough guy, and he fights tough, and I think that it's going to be a very dirty, very ugly race. And whatever Republican wins, they're going to have to run a very good campaign because Harry Reid will be coming after them. Now, let me just talk. Well, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what I think she was getting at, and it does make sense. It wasn't that long ago in truth. I think she said our grandparents, and she, in some cases, our parents' generation, and rural parts of the country literally did. You would go to the doctor and give them a chicken or whatever, right? Whatever you had, and they would, fix your broken arm in exchange for whatever you could give them. And I think the point she's getting at is simply that it used to be that you would have a relationship with your doctor, and that it was a direct personal relationship, and you could not just barter but also bargain with them, and there weren't third parties. It wasn't like nowadays. You typically don't know how much a doctor charges, don't care how much he charges, because your insurance that you get from your employer is going to pay for it. And I think that's what she was getting at. But the chicken thing, I will call it inartful. And it reminds me of when I was in college and I was trying to make an illustration one time about incrementalism. And I brought up this story about how do you boil a frog. And you probably know the analogy is if you wanted to boil a frog, you slowly turn up the heat and he won't realize it. He won't jump out. If you throw a frog into boiling water, he jumps out. If you throw him into a pan with lukewarm water and you slowly turn up the heat, you can have frog for dinner. Now, you can imagine, though, that the 20-year-olds in my political science class, when when I'm making a conservative argument and I say, it's like, how do you boil a frog? They thought I was insane, just as people think Sue Loudon is, weird talk. It's weird to talk about chickens. Like, I get her point. It's not a horrible point. But it's inartful, and I think that this is what Republicans have to look forward to with Harry Reid. I think it's going to be very tough on them.
Now, I wonder if this is a offshoot. I watch Glenn Beck from time to time just to check in, and I gather that does he always start the show with that 1940s era cardboard cutout of a TV set?
I don't know, man. I don't watch Glenn Beck that much.
Ah, scandal.
I watch him sometimes.
But I often see him when I do.
He's on against Hardball. What do you expect?
I dropped my cable. So actually, I don't watch any of this stuff anymore. But I've seen him. He's sitting next to this old TV, and with this sort of sad sack look on his face, like, oh, remember when we had it so good in the 1950s? What's happened to the America that we used to love? That kind of thing. And I wonder if Sue Loudoun was trying to sort of play that nostalgia card, which I think works for a Glenn Beck when you only, this is back to the indie rock analogy.
Right.
If you only need to have an audience of 5 million people in the 55 and over demographic to have a successful 5 p.m. cable TV show, that's fine. If you got to appeal to a wider set of voters to get 50%, when most of them did not pay their doctors and chickens at any point of their lifetimes, it's not a great reference point. Yeah,
it is a weird analogy. I think I get what she's saying, but and for somebody who lived in New Jersey and has lived in Nevada for I think Las Vegas basically for the last 30 years, it's
she's not rural.
No, I wouldn't think so. I mean, she was Miss New Jersey, and then she was a,
No, New Jersey has its farms.
Well, they do. It's the Garden State, Bill.
That's right.
But in any event, she's been she was like the face, the most known newscaster in Nevada for a decade or something, and I think she was the Republican Party chairman in Nevada for a while. By the way, the Ron Paul people hate her because of the way things went down at the convention out there when he was running for president. So it is an interesting dynamic. It is interesting as well. Conservatives, even conservative groups, are split. I think Eric Erickson is siding with Danny Tarkanian. I don't know if he's endorsed him, but he's supporting him. But then you have groups like the Susan B. Anthony list supporting Sue Loudoun. So it's a very weird dynamic out there. I think Loudon's going to win, but I think it's going to be a very ugly campaign, a very ugly general election. Harry Reid is tough, and I think
or an hilarious general election.
Well, do you think Saturday Night Live will address this chicken question?
This is the kind of story that I think blogs are well designed to push, and I believe there was some formal Democratic Party, maybe DSCC did some stuff on this too, but bloggers are sort of a good antenna to what will make a good turn a politician into a joke. So when you see that kind of blog swarm around an issue like this, a political entity's going to say, "Hey, this thing's moving. Let's jump on that." If bloggers weren't around, maybe a comment like that would get shrugged off more easily.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think it was Saul Alinsky, but maybe
your
not.
favorite.
I've known about Saul Alinsky for years, way before any of this stuff happened. I even recommended him on a reading list I put together like 10 years ago, or maybe 8 years ago. But I think he talked about how mockery is an underrated political tool.
Absolutely.
And this is mockery right here.
No, if you can pick your target, ridicule it was always a classic Alinsky strategy.
So, all right, where to now, Bill?
Well, there's a little flap brewing over at the corner at the National Review between the conservative intellectuals and the conservative rabble.
Yes, indeed. Let's see. So, I guess the first thing that happened was, well, it's interesting. Mark, a guy named Manzi. What's his first name? Jim Manzi. I've never even heard of this guy before, but apparently he's a sort of a Ross Douthat.
I've seen him as sort of a go-to conservative on global warming issues. Someone has been held up as a conservative who is. Forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing his view. I apologize. Someone in the comments wants to correct me. someone who's somewhat of a global warming skeptic, but not, but much more rooted in science and rational thought than the bulk of the global warming denier community, or perhaps better characterized as someone who believes it's happening but doesn't think it's as urgent as others do, and therefore more modest policy prescriptions could be offered. And so I've seen him be in a lot of point-counterpoint stuff on the issue. And I've generally seen other conservatives, like holding him up as to say, look, we have smart intellectual guys too, so don't call us a bunch of know-nothings.
Well, let me just read from you this guy Hogan, who blogs at Red State. It'll sum it up nicely. Yesterday, our friend Mark Levine was attacked on the corner over at National Review.
I just want to stop you for 1 second.
Yes, sir.
I think there are some people out there who don't know who Mark Levine is, believe it or not.
Mark Levine is one of the most popular conservative radio show hosts in America. He has a best-selling book, and I think he was at one point Sean Hannity's producer. I think he was Ed Meese's chief of staff as well. Very smart guy, but he kind of talks like this. He has a very weird voice for a radio host. He does not have a great radio voice, but he's one of the most popular radio hosts on the AM dial. Very conservative, and he also writes a National Review. So Hogan, and by the way, it is Levine, not Levin, as we've debated here before. Let's see. Now, this guy goes on to say that they're having this fight, and he says, Mark can dish it out pretty hard on his radio show and otherwise, so I'm not worried about his feelings in this instance. What I am concerned about, however, is the extent to which those who fancy themselves conservative intellectuals, folks like Manzi from Douthit, Brooks, Sullivan, and others, believe they are the second coming of Bill Buckley. Hardly. But dismiss talk radio show hosts and forums like Red State as nothing more than blowhard hacks who pour out their own Kool-Aid to the slobbering masses, too stupid to know the difference. He goes on to talk about it. I mean,
now, what could have Manzi have said to warrant such a incendiary response?
Well, look, this is all about the environment. Levine wrote a very popular book. I think it was called Liberty and Tyranny. And the book has a chapter on global warming, and it's pretty dismissive of it. Manzi took issue with that. But to me, that's an ancillary issue. The real issue here are a couple of dynamics that I think the Weekend Blog would be appropriate to discuss. Number one would be, do you attack somebody on your own site? I say yes. I like that. But Tony Kornheiser got suspended for criticizing somebody on ESPN. So there are people who believe you don't go after somebody on your own site. I think that's a good, healthy debate. Some sites differ. So before I move on, Bill, let me get your opinion on this. Is it appropriate for a group blog to essentially go after each other?
I mean, I would think that would make for a good group blog.
I would too.
Some discussion. If it's just all everyone singing off the same song sheet, it's a pretty boring blog.
I completely agree. But there are people who see it differently. Now, I would say that National Review's The Corner is a very good open forum for that. And what's interesting is this is spilled out not only to Red State, it's also spilled out to the American Spectator, where Robert Stacey McCain, a.k.a. the Hunter S. Thompson of the conservative blogosphere, writes, what's next? Can we expect Manzi to posture as a martyr, to portray Levine's defense as an act of aggression, and perhaps to claim that he is being, quote, purged by intolerant right-wingers? So I think this speaks to the second point that I wanted to talk to you about, which is this schism between what I would call kind of conservative intellectual writers versus the lumpen proletariat, the lowly bloggers and talk radio hosts. And I think it's very interesting. This has been boiling for a long time. But I mean, is this very inside baseball for conservatives, or have you witnessed this, or does this manifest itself on the left as well?
Well, I mean, if I understand the original Manzi piece correctly, his main point was that Levine's book, using the global warming section as an example, was a case of not even bothering with addressing serious counter arguments to your view, and creating a closed loop where you're not having any kind of useful debate, and that is going to essentially lead to a sort of intellectual atrophy, where you're not being kept in a good intellectual shape, and your points aren't going to be made as sharp. And I certainly think this happens on both sides of the fence.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can make an argument that it's not one of the better after effects of the blogging phenomenon. Not that I think that blogging is the cause of such a siloization of a political debate. I think that if our traditional media outlets were doing a better job at having serious intellectual debate, then this wouldn't be an issue. But we see plenty of weak argumentation in newspaper columns and cable TV shouting and the like. Blogging is merely just an extension of that. And I don't think it's healthy for either philosophy, liberal or conservative, or moderate for that matter. I see plenty of quote-unquote moderate. In fact, if I may do a plug for my own group, Campaign for America's Future, we're having a virtual summit on fiscal and economic responsibility, which is intended as a counter-narrative to the Pete Peterson-funded deficit hysterics. They're pushing a lot of deficit hysteria propaganda this month because there's the Whiteout Debt Commission on April 27th, and Peterson's funding a fiscal summit on the 28th, where they're positioning themselves as these consummate truth tellers, telling you the absolute truth about the abysmal deficit path that we're on. But in many respects, they're just as ideological as anybody else, using a lot of cherry-picked facts and ignoring counter-arguments, and having a very one-sided discussion. So I whether you agree with you're a conservative and you don't like what Manzi thinks about global warming, I think Manzi is saying, hey, global warming is happening. I just may not think of it, the policy prescription the same as the left does, but I think if you're Levine and you're just dismissing any argument that global warming exists, you are not helping your own cause and having a strong internal discussion. If you disagree with Manzi's political view on global warming, I would think it's in your interest to take his call to have a rich internal debate within conservatism, within liberalism, within centrism, and across these platforms. If we were having more of that, I think we'd lead to a lot of better policy outcomes and have a more informed public. But that's just me.
Well, there is something I agree with Manzi on, but let me just read to you his diatribe here real quick. He says, I started to read Mark Levine's massive bestseller, Liberty and Tyranny, a number of months ago. As debate swirled around it, I wasn't expecting a PhD thesis, and in fact had hoped to write a post supporting the book and a well-reasoned case for certain principles that upset academics just because it didn't employ a bunch of pseudo-intellectual tropes. But when I waded into the first couple of chapters, I found that while I had a lot of sympathy for its basic points, it seemed to all but ignore the most obvious counter-arguments that could be raised to any of its assertions. He goes on to say, it was awful, it was so bad, it was like the proverbial clock that chimes 13 times. Not only is it obviously wrong, but it's so wrong that it leads you to question every other piece of information it is provided. The thing I want to agree with Manzi on is how much these books written by famous conservative talk show hosts and personalities really generally suck. I really can't read them. I don't know, like, how can they sell so many copies of these books? And, like, if you've read one, like if you've read Ann Coulter's Godless, or Laura Ingram's Power to the People, or Hannity's whatever, and they sell a lot of books, how can you keep reading these same, like, every conservative talk show host puts out a book, and it's about, like, why we must defend our freedom, why we're right, they're wrong. And I just don't get, they don't really say anything after a while. I already agree with them. I already listen to 3 hours of Rush every day and an hour or two of Hannity. I'm Hannitized already. The books don't. I mean, look. Maybe I'm sure there's some that are very good, and I've not read Levine's book. I've looked it over. I've excerpted it or whatnot, but I've not actually fully read it. But my point being, mostly these books aren't that good, and why is that? And why do books sell so many copies that aren't?
Well, on the left, we've always tried to point out that whenever these conservative books get to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, they often have that asterisk next to them that there have been reports of bulk sales, which would mean that there have been various conservative foundations or organizations that will buy 10,000 copies and give it away as part of a promotion. And that's not quite the same as actually getting an organic bestseller. So that could be part of it.
I think that happens,
but many people who are reading these books cover to cover.
But Levine's book, well, that may be true too. Books sit on coffee tables or bookshelves, and certainly there are conservative book, things, for lack of the appropriate word. But clearly, I mean, Levine's book is flying off the shelf. It is wildly popular, and for whatever reason.
Well, in his
maybe
book,
it's the same reason
both
that
him and Michelle Malkin's book Culture of Corruption sort of got out of the gate early.
Yeah.
In the Obama era, my friend David Reese, who did the comic strip Get Your War On throughout all of the Bush administration, he did the first sharp political satire post 9/11. It was like only a couple weeks afterwards when everyone was kind of shell shocked. And when there are folks on the left that were a little, queasy about some of the, so they weren't, wanting Al-Qaeda to succeed by a long shot, but still a little queasy about the jingoistic response, although it wasn't going to be helpful to countering terrorism, didn't quite know how to articulate it, and David Reese was sort of the first one out of the box to criticize in very sharp terms, and because he was, one, it was funny, but two, he was the first mover. And so he got a whole lot of fans being first out of the gate.
Yeah,
and I think Levine and Michelle, hit that spot for conservatives this time around.
And maybe also it goes back to maybe we can go full circle here. And I know I'm not allowed to use Eagles references anymore, but maybe we can go full circle and end with the whole alternative or independent indie rock analogy, which is like, Nickelback sells a lot more albums than OK Go, I think we can agree there. So maybe this is like the Nickelback.
I read on Fox News that OK Go is the biggest rock band on the planet.
Well, they're big on YouTube. Their video, I don't think they sell a lot of product, but their videos, the one with the treadmill, that was quite good.
I'm an old man. I listen to country.
I like the old country. Waylon and Willie. Pat Green is good. I like the alt country. I like Bryan Adams. I've probably mentioned him here before. So. But
continue with your point, sir.
My point is that sometimes what the masses like is not the best.
Not the highest in quality.
Sometimes, but there is also the wisdom of the crowds, and the American people at the end of the day get it right.
So are you telling me that you're a Jim Manzi fan at the end of the day? You are siding with the conservative intellectuals and not with the conservative masses?
Look, I haven't gotten to the point yet where I've come down on the Manzi issue in terms of who's right and who's wrong. But I do think that there is a sort of underreported schism between conservative bloggers and talk radio hosts who probably do more good to advance the conservative cause than between conservative intellectuals and writers who probably don't appreciate fully what the Eric Ericksons and Rush Limbaughs of the world do. I'm sort of maybe a little bit in the middle. I think I have an appreciation for them all, and I've always argued that the conservative movement everybody has their own role, and just like in the old days, you had activists like Paul Weyrich and Phyllis Schlafly, but you had to have intellectuals like William F. Buckley. You had to have writers and reporters like Bob Novak, and you had to have leaders like Ronald Reagan. It takes a village to lead a movement, Bill.
Well, I guess the question is the conservative movement today missing its intellectual piece? Is anyone trying to be a conservative intellectual getting run out of town? And so you can't have, and I think it was John Derbyshire a year or so ago that was saying, look, you got to have, nothing wrong with comfort food, with lowbrow conservatism on talk radio, but you got to have some highbrow too, to round everything out. I mean, is that if Manzi's going to get browbeat for making a simple point that, hey, well, if you're going to write an actual book, why don't you actually address real criticisms of your point? If that's going to get you a beat down, how are you going to have a serious intellectual component to your movement?
Well, like I said, I'm very open to debate, so I don't necessarily think what Manzi did was inappropriate, but there certainly are people who would say he went after Levine, he drew first blood, as Sylvester Stallone might say. Levine didn't go after Manzi, and Levine writes at National Review, and Manzi, out of the blue, went after him, and I'm not talking about like a paragraph. It wasn't just a tweet, hey, I read Levine's book, wasn't as good as I hoped. I mean, he out of the blue, unprovoked, launched an attack on Levine. So I think
you mean it more personal.
Yeah, and so I think that part of the issue here, and part of the reason that Manzi's kind of losing the public relations war, is that some people see it as just sort of inappropriate. Not that he's wrong on the facts. That's a whole different topic. But it was maybe untoward, whatever, however you pronounce that.
If Manzi had a more gentle essay that lightly encouraged people to be more thoughtful in their long-form writing, it'll be useful to the conservative movement if we have a better give and take on issues, and to seriously look our criticisms in the eye and address them head on. Maybe cite a smattering of examples of people and not just focus on one person. Would anyone notice? I mean, is this part of the blogging phenomena that if you don't get a good punch to the jaw to somebody, no one's going to notice what it is that you said in the first place?
That's a good point. Certainly, controversy sells. I mean, we're talking about this here today, Bill. We probably wouldn't be talking about it if it was just a nice civil conversation. But I also think another issue is the sour grapes sort of jealousy issue. I think sometimes people like Manzi, and I'm not saying he's guilty of this, but they kind of look down at these talk radio hosts whom they view as inferior intellectually, and say, why are they getting book deals? Why are they selling, millions of books or hundreds of thousands of books? And I wrote a little book and it sold 3,000 copies or something. And my book's better. My book's more intellectual, and maybe it is.
I would not know about this dynamic at all.
Well, you should have written Rush Limbaugh as a big fat idiot, Bill, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. So anyway, look, I've intentionally not come to a lot of conclusions. I'm here to raise questions and to start a debate among our commenters and our readers, not to answer the questions.
You're a philosopher.
That is exactly right.
Well, it's always good to talk to you, Matt.
Always good to talk to you.
Always the highlight of my week.
Well, I doubt that, but if I can bring a little bit of sunshine into your life, I'm happy to do so.
Well, till next week.
Till next week. That didn't set up my line. It's. Did
I botch the outro?
Wherever you are, we will see you next week on The Week in Blog.
There you go.
Thank you.